tying up a wet fly today. This is called the John Storey wet fly. There's an interesting history about this fly. I was asked by a follower to tie this particular fly and do a little research on it. And there is a dry fly version of this, let me put it that way. And I've already done a video on that. John Storey originally created this as a wet fly, but as the story goes, his grandson, who was tying these, I'm assuming for production and selling them, either didn't like the way it was tied as a wet fly or came up with the dry fly version, and that became more popular. I think there's a reason why he had a little bit of difficulty with it. It has to do with the fact that these flies 100 years ago were all tied by hand. Different techniques when you're tying by hand versus having a modern vise. So I'm going to tie two versions of this. The first one is going to be using modern techniques. And basically, but when I say modern, I mean techniques that have probably been around for 30, 40, 50 years. But I'm going to tie the same fly using some modern techniques and then discuss how they were tied and demonstrate more or less how they were tied by hand many, many years ago. I'm not going to tie this by hand. I am going to use the vise, but I'll have a discussion which helps to explain, I think, how the dry fly version came to be. So that's the John Storey wet fly. I'll get busy tying. I'm going to start the John Storey wet fly with my hook in the vise. This is a Mustad 3399 in a size 8. If you watched the dry fly version that I did of the John Storey fly, it was on a small dry fly hook. But and you could tie this on a smaller hook if you want, but because it was a wet fly and because of part of the technique that's I'm going to talk about and demonstrate today, I'm just going to go with a little bit bigger hook. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to tie this fly as you would kind of a modern day wet fly technique, because it's important to understand that how these flies are tied these days, not exactly how they were tied, 100 years ago when most tyers were tying all by hand. So that means I'm going to tie in first the body, because it's just a Peacock Herl body, a collared hackle, and then the wing. So I'm going to tie the body in first. Same materials as the dry fly. It's just a little bit different order in tying. I'm going to advance my thread forward to about an eye length behind the eye of the hook. I'm going to take that Peacock Herl and wrap that around for the body. I've got about 6 strands of Peacock Herl here, just because it's going to fill it up a little bit more, and I can fill that space in a little bit quicker if I had just say 2 or 3 Peacock Herls. Because it's a little bit bigger fly, I want the body to be just a little bit proportionally, just a little bit bigger. So most of your wet flies, this is what you're doing. You're tying in your tip or your tail, your rib, and then the body, and so on and so forth on this as you work your way up to either tying in a throat or a collared hackle and then the wing. Now the throat on this, the hackle is I'm just using a hen saddle feather. This is just a brown hen saddle. You could, I suppose, put this in as a throat. Putting these in as the hackles as throats is very popular in a lot of wet flies. I don't know that the original John Storey wet fly was done that way. I am kind of assuming for different reasons that it was actually a collar, which I'll talk about in just a little bit. Remember, this is a more modern technique of tying a wet fly being applied to the John Storey wet fly. So I'm not saying that this is, exactly how it was tied. The focus of the video is more on how the dry fly came about, but you have to see the wet fly version and understand the difference between tying a wet fly these days with the equipment that we have and modern techniques versus tying a wet fly 100 years ago. Now, the wing on this is just a mallard flank. So I'm going to use, I've got a nice mallard flank right here, and all I'm going to do is get these barbs out perpendicular to the rachis so that I can peel these out, kind of roll these together just to make a wing, just a mallard flank wing. If you've got a feather that's nice enough and you want to cut out nice matched slips, you can certainly do that. I think this works just as well, especially as a fishing fly, because even a nice matched mallard wing is going to all this is going to get kind of broken up as you're fishing it. So with that tied in, one thing I want to point out is you'll notice that the head on this is a little bit smaller. These days, we have the benefit of having a vise in our fly tying. That gives us a third hand that we can tie these in and create these flies in a little bit different manner, and they make things just a little bit neater, maybe a little more polished. So I'm going to go ahead and do my whip finish. And because this is a wet fly, I would go ahead and put some black lacquer on this. Right now, I'm just going to put a little bit of head cement, some fly tight head cement on here. That's to soak down and seal up those thread wraps. And then it'll come back and put a couple coats of black lacquer on there, or probably a coat or two of clear lacquer and then a top coat of black lacquer. So that's the John Storey wet fly tied with using more modern techniques. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tie the same fly again, but I'm going to tie this not by hand, which is how they were tied originally, but I am going to tie it in the same manner as they did by hand. And that is that the wing is the first item that is tied in. Same hook. There's a book out called The History of Fly Fishing in 50 Flies by a gentleman by the name of Ian Whitelaw. In that book, he talks about wet flies, and he actually has a very, very nice drawing. Look down in the description, and I will include the page that it's on because I don't know it off the top of my head. It's a very, very nice drawing that explains how these dry flies were tied a long time ago. Keeping in mind, 100 years ago, they were tying mostly by hand. So you're holding all of this, and it's difficult to hold the hook and the material in and then wrap this in with your hand. So it was harder for them to create the fly and then tie the wing in last, and hold it all in place and tie that in. And they didn't have the advantage of this being held so that they could just, cut the end off. So what they did was they took their wings. I'm going to use some mallard flank again for the wing here. Same technique. I'm just going to, again, if you want to do this with matched wings, you certainly can, as I showed in the first. And I would probably do that, the matched wings, using the modern technique, because when you tie this in, you're not going to tie it in with the wing pointing backwards. You're going to tie this in with the wing facing forward. You're going to tie this in so that, and notice that I'm about 2 eye lengths behind the eye of the hook. I want this to be from the tip here to where I tie it in about 1.5 times the hook length. And the reason is, one, I'm going to wrap forward to bind that wing in, leaving some space where it's not wrapped in quite yet. But what we're going to do is, at the end of the fly, we're going to put the body and the hackle in. What they would do when tying by hand is they would tie it in like this, because the last step was just to fold over the wing and then wrap that in to create the wing of the fly. So that's what we're going to do on this one. That's a little bit long, but you get the point. And this is where I think, because tying by hand is not really, super easy. Certainly, plenty of people did learn the skills and they could do that. But I think this is where the grandson of John Storey just either didn't like doing it, or for whatever reason. That's the story that I've heard, is that the grandson had difficulty tying the John Storey and eventually came up with the dry fly version. So you can see in this one where, let me get my Peacock Herl. So I have tied in the wing, and now I will go back and I'll tie in some Peacock Herl for the body, and then we'll tie in the hackle and collar the hackle, and then fold that over to make our wing. So leaving a little bit of room for that collar, I'm going to wrap in the body. Yeah. And you could have a little bit less room there if you want, if you just don't want as much hackle. And then selecting basically the same size hackle. It's just a small hen saddle hackle. So all of this is similar to the modern technique. It's just that the wing isn't already in place. Now I'll wrap that in, coming right up behind, right where I'm wrapped. Now you'll notice, like I said, I've got maybe just a little 2-3 thread wraps right behind the eye that I haven't finished yet. Meaning I haven't wrapped the hackle all the way up, the wing down. Now be careful with this here, because we want to keep the hackle back, but we don't want to grab the wing yet. So we're going to secure that in with 2 or 3 wraps. Cut away the excess. Now I'm going to wrap back just a wrap or 2, and that places my thread further back. And the reason is, if I have my thread right up here, not in front, but if I wrap this and the thread's right here, when I fold this over, it's going to come to the front of that and just fall right down. Having it a wrap or 2 backwards allows me to have a little bit of space. As you can see, I can wrap on top of that wing and fold it over. A couple wraps rearward towards the back. Trim out this little hair. Gotta make this all look just perfect. That wing is a little bit long. Now, I had that gap right up front here, and the reason is I'm going to start wrapping right behind the eye of the hook, building that thread up to then come up and cover up that folded over mallard flank. This is the reason, if you look at some older wet flies that were tied 70, 80, 100 years ago, many of them, the heads they're just not as polished as the internet shows them today. And that'll get covered up with some black lacquer. But they're also bigger. So I'll do my whip finish here real quick, and I'll show you comparison. Again, having a vise is really handy these days because, you've got this third hand that holds everything in place, and the techniques that are used are help produce a fly that just looks a little more polished. Keeping in mind, the fish don't care, so it doesn't have to be looking really nice and polished to be able to fish well. But this is the wet fly that I did just a few minutes ago. And if you'll notice, the head on this one is definitely smaller because of it's not folded over. So if you look in that book I mentioned by Ian Whitelaw, like I said, look for the page number in the description. It'll show you an illustration of this particular technique that was used when doing these by hand. Nowadays, they're not done by hand, but my summation here is that the grandson either had a difficult time tying that wing in out front, doing the fly and folding it over, especially if it's a collared hackle, getting all that, hackle in just right without getting all this trapped in it. So therefore, he just left it out, and probably left it out one time just to say, let's try that. Went fished it like a dry fly. It was successful. It became popular. So that is the John Storey, I should say the story behind the John Storey wet fly, I think. I have not read this anywhere. I don't have any documentation or anything on it. I'm just looking at the different flies and knowing different older techniques and things. Like I said, that's my conclusion as to how the John Storey dry fly came about from the original John Storey wet fly. So that's the John Storey wet fly. Thanks for watching today. Thank you for joining me at the Vise today. I hope you learned a new pattern, at least a tip or trick here and there. If you'd like to help Dress Irons, you can like, comment, share, subscribe, all those wonderful things for the video. You can also head out to dressedirons.com where you can buy flies, tools, stickers, and merch, or you can join a growing community over on Locals at the Dressed Irons Fly Tying Guild. You can also donate to Dressed Irons if you want through the link at the bottom of the description. I thank everybody for their ongoing support, as it really does help the creation of these videos. And what's important is to remember, only fly tying. If you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong.